Hey, welcome to the Business and Society podcast. Today is special. This is our very first episode of the Right Way mini series. I'm your host, Senthil.
And I'm the co host, Vihaan. Together, we tell inspiring stories of business ethics, leadership, and social responsibility.
We hope you enjoy this episode.
So, what story are we telling today?
Hmm. This is a story that's taught in business schools around the world to explain leadership and ethics. It's about a brand and a company most of us know well. So well, in fact, that I personally used this product twice in the past 7 days alone. But enough teasing. Should we tell our listeners what it is?
Yes, let's go for it.
All right. Today's story is about the Tylenol crisis. Tylenol, according to its current owner, is the number one doctor recommended pain reliever in the United States.
For listeners outside the United States, Tylenol is known as paracetamol in many parts of the world. It's often the first medicine people reach for when they have a headache or pain, and it's sold over the counter in pharmacies and grocery stores. So, Appa, what exactly was the Tylenol crisis?
Hmm. Let's travel back in time. It's 1982. At that time, Tylenol was owned by Johnson and Johnson. You know Johnson and Johnson, right?
Yes, I do.
Right. So Tylenol was owned by Johnson and Johnson. The brand was enormously successful. It accounted for 13% of the company's year-on-year sales growth and 33% of its profits. One out of every three painkillers sold in the United States then was Tylenol. In fact, it outsold the next four competitors combined, just Anasin, Bayer, Bufferin, and Excedrin. One scholar even said that if Tylenol had been its own company, it would have ranked in the top half of the Fortune 500 list. Do you know what
That
Fortune 500 is?
no, but I do know the Fortune magazine.
Exactly. So Fortune 500 is the list of top 500 companies in the United States, and this list is published by Fortune magazine. So that's why it's called Fortune 500 companies.
Oh,
Anyway, we'll get back to Tylenol now.
okay. That sounds like a success story. Where does the crisis come in?
Yes, Tylenol was a success story, but also a deeply tragic one. Early in the morning of September 29, 1982, a 12-year-old girl in a suburb of Chicago woke up with a sore throat and a runny nose. Her parents gave her one extra strength Tylenol capsule, unaware that it had been laced with potassium cyanide. She was dead by 7 a.m. That same day, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus died suddenly, and people initially thought to be a heart attack, but later identified as cyanide poisoning. His brother and sister in law rushed to his home to console the family. Both developed headaches, understandable in such a moment, and each took Tylenol from the same bottle. Stanley died that day. Teresa died 2 days later. Over the next few days, three more deaths followed. Seven people died in total, and all had taken Tylenol shortly before their deaths. By early October 1982, investigators connected the poisonings to Tylenol.
That's heartbreaking. Do we know who did it?
Hmm. Surprisingly, to this day, the murderer, or could be murderers, have never been found. But there are so many conspiracy theories floating around. The most widely known involves a man named James Lewis who sent a ransom letter to Johnson and Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the poisonings. But after an extensive investigation, he had no proven connection to the Chicago deaths. In fact, he passed away in 2023, but the Tylenol mystery remains unsolved.
Wow.
Yes. And this brings us to the heart of today's episode. Before the crisis, Tylenol controlled over 35% of the market. Within weeks of the crisis, the number collapsed to under 8%. Lives have been lost, public trust was shattered, and the business faced an existential threat. But every crisis creates space for leadership to emerge, right? And in this story,
Yeah.
a hero does emerge, someone we'll talk about shortly.
But Johnson and Johnson was a trusted company, right? You've told me you've bought lots of their products for me when I was a baby.
Yes, we did. When you were a baby, we bought a lot of Johnson and Johnson products for you. Indeed, we bought a lot of J&J's products for your sister too. And Johnson and Johnson has a long history of ethical leadership. One of the best accounts of this comes from a book called The Enlightened Capitalist by James O'Toole. Many of the stories we share today in this episode come from Jim's work. He was an extraordinary scholar, and he was also a guest on this podcast. Speaking
Oh,
with him
cool.
actually inspired me to launch the Right Way series. Now, Johnson and Johnson was founded in 1886 by brothers James Johnson and Edward Mead Johnson. That's why the name Johnson and Johnson. Jim,
Oh, now I know.
yes, it is. That is the reason it's called Johnson and Johnson. And Jim describes one of their early factories like this, and I quote, "At a time when American factories were dirty, dismal, and unsafe, Johnson and Johnson built a facility that was clean, well lit, and comfortable. Workers were well paid, and it was the first factory in the region not to employ children." End of quote. And by that
Hmm.
time, child labor was very prevalent in factories. And
Oh.
Jim also notes that Johnson and Johnson's overseas facilities match the standards of its US operations, rare for global companies even today.
Yeah.
And during the Great Depression, you know a bit about Great Depression, right?
Yes, in fact, I researched about it in school.
Excellent. So during the Great Depression, Johnson and Johnson reduced work hours instead of laying off workers and actually created new jobs. Their general manager even publicly urged all American employers to pay a living wage. Not
Oh.
surprisingly, yeah, not surprisingly, many business
Hmm.
leaders were furious because it drives up costs.
Yeah.
So, when asked during a congressional hearing whether he belonged to the National Manufacturers Association, the president of Johnson and Johnson replied, and I quote, "Senator, I've tried very hard, but I have been unable to find a sympathetic group of colleagues in organized business." End of quote. So, in many ways, Johnson and Johnson helped define what we now call corporate social responsibility or CSR.
So that kind of gives us a clue about how they might respond to the Tylenol crisis, right?
Exactly, you got it. The CEO at that time was James Burke, a Harvard MBA. He later said that what surprised him most about Harvard was how deeply moral values were woven into the decision making. And when the crisis hit, those values were put to the ultimate test.
So, what did he do?
First, even before confirming the company wasn't responsible, Burke took full responsibility. He was not washing his hands off from the crisis. There is a video of him on YouTube speaking to the media immediately after the crisis. His voice is steady, serious, and deeply human. Despite enormous legal risk, he spoke openly and compassionately. And against legal advice, he even allowed investigative journalists into Johnson& Johnson's crisis management meetings. Now think of it. You call an investigative journalist to your internal crisis management meeting. Isn't it
Yeah,
brave?
that's brave, very brave.
That's very brave. Second, Burke formed a cross functional executive team that met twice daily for 6 weeks. During the meeting, some executives strongly disagreed with him about his approach, about the way he handled things, and there is a YouTube video footage showing Burke engaging respectfully, listening carefully,
Oh.
and weighing every perspective, not to assert his power. It's a masterclass in leadership under pressure.
But the financial impact must have been huge, right?
It was. There's a huge financial impact. Aftermath of the crisis, J&J stock dropped 20%. Experts predicted the death of the Tylenol brand, rightfully so, right? Imagine, you take a pill and it's laced with,
Yeah, true.
it's not an easy thing.
Hmm.
One advertising executive, he was like a leading advertising guru of that time, he said, and I quote, "In a year, it'll be hard to find a product called Tylenol." End of quote. Despite this, Burke recalled every bottle of Tylenol nationwide, not just in the affected area, states, districts,
Hmm.
every
Yeah.
bottle he recalled nationwide, despite a huge financial cost. In fact, it's the FBI
Yeah.
said that J&J recalled the bottles far faster than expected. And in fact, Burke
Wow.
offered to refund customers even for open bottles, not just the bottles
Oh.
on the shelves.
Oh. That's incredible.
It is incredible. In fact, J&J then redesigned packaging with three tamper-resistant seals. Now an industry standard. You go and buy a pill in
Yeah.
supermarket or pharmacy, you can see those three seals. Burke personally presented the solution to the public and remained available for interviews throughout the crisis, answering every question honestly.
He really does sound like a hero.
He was a hero. Within a year, Tylenol regained public trust and also market leadership. The recall became a case study taught worldwide. In 1983, the United States Congress passed the Tylenol bill, making product tampering a federal crime. And in 2000, James Burke received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States.
Before we finish, where is Tylenol today?
Mm, Tylenol is now owned by Kenvue, with Johnson & Johnson spun off in 2023. The brand faces new challenges today, and there is ongoing speculation about potential acquisitions. But that's a story for another episode. But what today's story reminds us is that leadership isn't revealed in moments of comfort, but in moments of crisis. The Tylenol story shows us that doing the right thing, which are putting people first, being transparent, and acting with courage, can feel risky in the moment, but it's the only path to lasting trust. James Burke and Johnson & Johnson didn't just manage a crisis, they set a standard for what ethical leadership looks like. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on The Right Way. We'll be back soon with another powerful story of business ethics, leadership, and social responsibility.
Thanks for listening.